The events you're about to see are based on real accounts. To protect the identities of those involved, names and details have been changed. My name is Mitchell Carter. I'm 37 years old, and I live in Oakland, California. What I'm about to share happened 5 years ago, but to this day, I still can't fully understand what it was. I've talked about it a few times, but I always get the feeling that no one really believes me. Maybe writing here, in a place where people share strange experiences, I can at least get this off my chest. In 2019, I visited the Winchester Mansion. It wasn't planned at all. I was in San Jose for work and ended up with a free afternoon. Since I've always been fascinated by bizarre stories, I figured it was worth checking the place out. I had read about the mansion before, about the staircases that lead nowhere, the doors that open into walls. The idea of a house built to confuse spirits seemed absurd, but intriguing. I thought it would just be another tourist attraction, something to talk about later. I arrived in the middle of the afternoon and bought a ticket for the guided tour. The group was small, about 8 people besides me, and the guide was a woman named Lisa, who spoke with the rehearsed enthusiasm of someone who had told the same stories 1,000 times. She started explaining who Sarah Winchester was and why the mansion had such strange architecture. As we walked through the narrow hallways and entered weirdly structured rooms, I kept wondering how anyone could live there without losing their mind. The place was claustrophobic, and the feeling of constantly getting lost was real. The tour went on normally until, at one point, I got separated from the group. It wasn't intentional. I just stopped to look at a detail on the wall, a strange pattern in the wood that seemed to form a face, and when I turned around, the group was gone. I assumed they had turned a corner, so I followed the hallway, but instead of catching up with them, I found a slightly open door that wasn't locked. And without thinking too much, I stepped inside. The room was small, dimly lit by a window that was too high to see outside. There was no furniture, just an old carpet and a rusty iron chandelier on the ceiling. That's when I noticed the silence. Up until that moment, I could hear the group walking, the guide speaking, footsteps echoing down the halls. But in that room, there was nothing, no sound at all. It was like I had closed the door to the real world. I stood still for a moment, trying to understand what I was feeling. It wasn't exactly fear, but a discomfort that seemed to come from inside, like my body knew something was wrong before my mind could process it. And then suddenly, I heard a creaking sound behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone, maybe another lost tourist, maybe a mansion employee. But there was no one. Just the door, now completely shut. My first instinct was to laugh at myself. Maybe a draft had closed it, or maybe the floor was uneven. But when I tried to open it, the handle wouldn't turn. It was like it had locked from the inside. That's when the bad feeling truly set in. A strange coldness ran down my spine, and my skin prickled like someone had just run their hand down my arm. I stepped away from the door and looked around, searching for another exit. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, right where the light from the window barely reached, there was something. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but then it moved. It was a small, hunched figure, like it was sitting or crouching. I couldn't see a face, no hands, just a dark outline against the wall. My heart started pounding, and I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The thing in the corner moved again, and this time I was sure it wasn't my imagination. My whole body turned ice cold. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that thing without moving. Maybe seconds, maybe minutes. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a loud knock on the door behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. And when I looked back at the corner, the shadow was gone. The door creaked open on its own. On the other side, Lisa and the rest of the group were staring at me with confused expressions. "Did you go in there?" she asked, frowning. This room was supposed to be locked. I didn't know what to say. I glanced back one more time to make sure the thing wasn't there. But the room was empty. I stepped out without a word and tried to go through the rest of the tour as usual, but I couldn't focus on anything else. The feeling that something was wrong stayed with me for the rest of the day. When I got back to my hotel, I went straight to the bathroom and turned on the light. I stared at myself in the mirror for a long time, trying to understand what I was feeling. My face looked different, like I had aged a little. Or maybe it was just exhaustion. Since then, I've never been back to the Winchester mansion. I've thought about returning, just to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But every time I consider it, I remember the way I felt in that moment. The absolute silence in that room, that dark thing in the corner. And I changed my mind. My name is Landon Everett. I'm 38 years old and I live in Portland, Oregon. What I'm about to tell happened about 12 years ago when I took a trip to San Diego with my then girlfriend, Emily. We both always enjoyed exploring historical places, especially those with strange stories behind them. I'm not the kind of person who easily believes in these things, but the Whaley House made me question a lot. I walked in thinking it would just be another tourist attraction, but I walked out knowing that something in that place didn't want to be forgotten. The Whaley House looked harmless from the outside, a beautiful, restored building with that Victorian charm. Nothing about it screamed haunted. I knew it had been built over an old cemetery and that public hangings had taken place there, but honestly, I thought the worst I would feel was a heavy atmosphere. We entered the house with a small group of tourists and a guide who told stories about ghostly apparitions, mysterious laughter, and even strange smells that some people had reported experiencing inside. Emily and I exchanged skeptical glances, but we were ready for the experience. The first strange thing happened in the main room. Emily nudged me and whispered, "Did you see that?" I looked where she was pointing, but I saw nothing. She said she had seen a man in a dark suit standing in the hallway for a second before disappearing. I thought it was just a reflection from the windows or some shadow, but the way she turned pale made me doubt that. I tried not to dwell on it too much, but I started feeling uneasy, like we were being watched. It's hard to describe, not exactly fear, but an uncomfortable awareness that we were not alone. We continued the tour and reached the main staircase. The guide said that this was the most haunted part of the house because many people reported feeling a pressure on their chest, as if something invisible was weighing on them. The moment I stepped on the first step, a cold shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just the air conditioning, it was different, like walking through a current of air that wasn't there. Emily grabbed my arm tightly and whispered, "Landon, something is really wrong here." I tried to ignore it, but every step we took felt wrong, like we were going against something that didn't want us upstairs. On the second floor, we visited the bedrooms. That's when everything got worse. While the guide was talking about the Whaley family, I suddenly smelled strong tobacco, as if someone had just smoked a cigar in there. The problem was, no one in our group smoked, and the smell appeared out of nowhere. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A woman next to us asked if anyone else could smell that. The guide smiled and said, "That happens sometimes. People say it's Mr. Whaley still lingering in the house." Right then, we all heard a loud noise in the hallway, like something heavy had fallen to the floor. Everyone turned at the same time, but nothing was there. The guide tried to stay calm and said that old houses make noises, but you could see on his face that he wasn't entirely comfortable with that explanation. Then, without warning, one of the bedroom doors slammed shut, hard. I swear, there was no draft and no one was near that door. By that point, Emily was gripping my arm tightly and my heart was pounding. Still, we continued the tour until the end. When we went back downstairs, I started feeling pressure in my chest, like something was pressing down on me. My breathing became short, and I felt an irrational wave of terror. I don't suffer from anxiety, I've never had a panic attack, but for some reason my entire body was telling me to leave. Emily pulled on my arm and said, "We need to get out of here, now." As we were heading toward the exit, I heard footsteps right behind me. They weren't normal footsteps, they were slow, heavy, rhythmic, like someone deliberately walking down the stairs. I turned around expecting to see someone, but there was no one. We walked out of the house without looking back. The fresh air outside had never felt so good. Emily was shaking, and I was trying to process what had just happened. The guide came out a few minutes later and looked at us from a distance, as if he knew we had felt something. I don't know what's in the Whaley house, but it wasn't just suggestion or psychological tricks. Something is there, watching, following, maybe even trying to keep people from leaving. To this day, whenever I think about it, I feel that same pressure on my chest again. I never went back to San Diego, and I definitely wouldn't step into that house again, not even if someone paid me. I don't know what's trapped inside that place, but whatever it is, it doesn't want to be forgotten. My name is Malcolm Vance. I'm 46 years old, and I live in Joliet, Illinois. What I'm about to tell you happened to me 22 years ago, but I still can't explain it. I've tried to forget it, tried to tell myself it was just in my head, that maybe I was too tired that night, but nothing erases what I saw, or rather, what I experienced. I was never the kind of person who believed in ghosts, hauntings, or anything like that, but after that night, I'm not so sure anymore. At the time, I worked as a security guard in Chicago, and my shift always ended around 3 in the morning. It was an exhausting job, and driving back home was always a challenge. That night I was heading back to Joliet as usual, and decided to take a shortcut through Archer Avenue, a road that cuts through the town of Justice. Anyone who lives around here knows that this road has a reputation, especially near Resurrection Cemetery. I had heard some stories before, but I never paid much attention. I just wanted to get home faster. The road was empty, as it always was at that time of night. The car radio was off, and the only sound was the engine and the wind outside. That's when I saw her. A girl, standing on the shoulder, right near the cemetery gate. She was wearing a white dress, and looked to be no more than 20 years old. The strange thing was that she didn't seem scared or lost. She was just there, staring off into the distance. I slowed down without even thinking. A girl alone in the middle of the night. It seemed obvious she needed help. I rolled down the window and asked if she needed a ride. She just smiled and nodded. She didn't seem nervous, nor did she hesitate before getting in the car. What made me a little uncomfortable was the way she closed the door, too smoothly, as if the car didn't even shift with the movement. But I figured I was just tired and ignored it. I asked where she wanted to go, and she answered in a soft, almost whispering voice, "Home." She didn't say anything else, just looked out the window. As I drove, I tried to make conversation. I asked if she lived far, if she was okay, if she needed to call someone. She only gave short answers, as if she was there, but at the same time, not. The only thing she said more clearly was when we passed an old dance hall, a few minutes past the cemetery. She pointed at it and said, with a glimmer in her eyes, "I used to dance there." The way she said it gave me chills. The place looked abandoned. I kept driving, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in my gut. The street was deserted, and I just wanted to drop her off as quickly as possible. That's when I noticed something that made me grip the steering wheel tighter. The rearview mirror was positioned so I could see her sitting in the back seat, but something was off. Her reflection looked blurred, as if she wasn't entirely there. My heart started pounding. My instincts told me to stop the car and get out, but I couldn't. We were close to the address she had murmured. The silence in the car was unbearable. When I finally turned onto the right street, I looked back to let her know, and the seat was empty. My stomach dropped. There was no way she could have gotten out without me noticing. The car had been moving the entire time, and the doors were still locked. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, and this time my blood ran cold. The passenger door was slightly open, not wide open, but just enough to make my skin crawl. I sat there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. I looked down the street, expecting to see her walking, running, anything, but there was no one. Just old houses, some with their lights off, and an eerie silence. I took a deep breath and tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was so exhausted that I had confused everything. But then I glanced at the passenger seat, and what I saw made every hair on my body stand on end. The cushion was slightly indented, as if someone was still sitting there. I restarted the car and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't go straight home. I drove aimlessly for nearly an hour, trying to make sense of what had happened. When I finally got home, I went inside without looking back, locked all the doors, and went straight to bed. But I couldn't sleep. I just lay there, listening to the silence in the house, feeling a coldness that didn't make sense, even with all the windows shut. The next day, still uneasy, I did something I never thought I would do. I looked up information about the road and Resurrection Cemetery. And that's when I found something that made my heart pound. Her face. An old black and white photo of a young woman smiling in a white dress. They called her Resurrection Mary. According to stories, drivers over the years had reported picking up a young woman near the cemetery, only for her to vanish as they approached her destination. I shut my laptop immediately. I didn't want to know anymore. I spent the following days trying to forget, but some things don't let you move on so easily. In the weeks after, I started noticing strange things. Every time I drove late at night, I smelled a sweet perfume in the car, a scent I didn't recognize. Sometimes, the rearview mirror would be slightly tilted towards the back seat, as if someone had moved it. Once, I even heard the faint rustling of fabric behind me, even though I was alone. I never told many people about this. A few close friends know, but most laugh and say I was just tired, that my mind played tricks on me. Maybe I did imagine the whole thing. But even today, when I drive down that road, even in broad daylight, I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong there, something that doesn't belong to this world. I never drove down that road at night again. I never picked up another hitchhiker. But every time I think about that night, one thing still haunts me. The way she smiled when she mentioned the dance hall. Like she was reliving a happy moment. Like for a few minutes she had come home. My name is Graham Calloway. I'm 37 years old and I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. What I'm about to share happened to me about 10 years ago on a night that still gives me chills when I think about it. I was never the type to believe in hauntings, bad energy, or spirits trapped in places. But after what I experienced at the Haunt Mansion, I changed my mind. I'm not a ghost hunter or a thrill seeker looking for paranormal experiences. Honestly, I was just trying to take some photos of an abandoned ease. I worked as a freelance photographer back then and was trying to build a portfolio with images of old, abandoned buildings to sell to specialized magazines. A friend told me about the Haunt Mansion, a massive house built in the 1920s that, according to him, had once been a luxury brothel in the 1940s. He also mentioned some strange stories, reports of shadows, whispers, and even apparitions of women in old dresses walking through the halls. I laughed when he told me that, thinking it was just urban legend. The mansion was far from downtown Detroit, in a decayed area filled with old houses and no trespassing signs. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The upper floor windows were all broken and the facade was covered in graffiti. But despite its deteriorated appearance, the main structure was still standing, and it was clear that it had once been an elegant place. I jumped over a low fence, walked through an overgrown yard and found a side door slightly open. I stepped inside without. The smell was the first thing that bothered me. It was a mix of damp wood, dust, and something slightly metallic, almost nauseating. The entrance hall was enormous, with a chandelier hanging from the ceiling covered in grime. The wooden floor creaked under my feet, and the sound echoed through the empty house. I moved slowly, taking pictures of the staircase and hallways. The silence was absolute, and no matter how much I tried to focus on my work, a strange feeling started creeping in. It was as if I kept exploring. I passed through rooms with old furniture covered by torn sheets, a bar with dusty bottles, and a lounge with a stone fireplace. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. I went upstairs to the second floor where the bedrooms were, and that's when I started hearing the noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind passing through the cracks, but the sounds were different. Light footsteps, almost dragging, and a distant murmuring. When I went back down to the first floor, I was ready to leave. I had taken enough pictures and didn't want to spend more time in that place than necessary. But for some reason, I felt a strange pull toward the basement. I can't explain why. It was like something was calling me there. I found the door at the back of the house, unlocked, and walked down the stone steps with my flashlight in hand. The air down there was even heavier. The basement was large, with old brick walls and a low ceiling. The air was thick, and I felt my stomach turn. Then, the light from my flashlight landed on something on the floor, and my blood ran cold. There were circular marks on the concrete, perfectly drawn, as if they had been burned into the stone. In the center of each circle, dark stains. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but I knew what it looked like. My heart pounded, and a shiver ran down my spine. That's when I heard a noise behind me. I turned quickly, and for a split second, I swear I tried to run up the stairs, but as I reached the door, I heard something close to my ear. A slow whisper, as if someone was speaking very softly, but way too close. My entire body froze. I couldn't understand what was said, but the sound filled me with a fear I had never felt before. I gasped, pushed the door open with all my strength, and bolted out of the house without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached my car, parked a few blocks away. My hands were shaking so much that it took me a while. I never went back to the Haunt Mansion. A few weeks later, I researched more about the place and discovered that several bodies were found in the basement in the 1950s, all with those same circular marks on their torsos. Over the years, the stories of apparitions and strange noises only increased. Since that night, I've tried not to think about it too much, but sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I can still hear that whisper. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like to support the community. And if you're not subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new content. See you next time.